Okay, here we go. Follow along, please. End of Revolutionary War. The war is won. By the end of September, more than 16,000 American and French troops laid siege to Cornwallis's army of fewer than 8,000. A siege occurs when an army surrounds and blockades the enemy position in an attempt to capture it. One of the reasons we're talking about this right now, in the future, I'm going to be asking you what military strategy. And so anytime that we are learning about something where somebody is going around, where the military is surrounding the enemy, you should then be able to tell me that's a blockade. They sieged them, but how did they do it? They did it with a blockade. Day after day, American and French artillery pounded the British. For several weeks, Cornwallis held out. Finally, with casualties mounting and his supplies running low, the general decided that the situation was hopeless. The British had lost the Battle of Yorktown. So the Battle of Yorktown is the final battle in the American Revolution. If you wanted to go visit Yorktown, you would go, if you ever were visiting Virginia Beach, Virginia, or Hampton, all of that area has a lot of history. You can go to Yorktown. Has anybody been to Yorktown? On October 19, 1781, the British surrendered their weapons. The French and the Americans lined up in two facing columns. As the defeated redcoats marched between the victorious troops, a British army band played the tune, "The World Turned Upside Down." Now, at the end of the war, as with every war, the two opposing sides have to sign a treaty. Now, before the end of the American Revolution, there was another battle or war in the New World, and that was the French and Indian War. And the treaty that ended that battle between the French and the British was called the Treaty of Paris of 1763. In that treaty, all this yellow land that you see in that map became part of Britain. Now, after the American Revolution, and when Britain lost and America won, all this yellow land then becomes part of the United States. So although we usually think of just the first 13 colonies, it is all the land from the Mississippi east to the Atlantic Ocean, then the border of Canada around the Great Lakes south to Florida. That ends up becoming the land after the American Revolution. The talks began in Paris, 1782. Congress sent Benjamin Franklin and John Adams, along with John Jay of New York and Henry Laurens of South Carolina, to work out a treaty. Because Britain was eager to end the war, the Americans got most of what they wanted. Under the Treaty of Paris of 1783, the British recognized the United States as an independent nation. It extended from the Atlantic Ocean to the Mississippi River. The northern border of the United States stopped at the Great Lakes. The southern border stopped at Florida, which was returned to Spain. For their part, the Americans agreed to ask the state legislatures to pay for loyalists for property they had lost in the war. In the end, however, most states ignored loyalist claims. On April 15, 1783, Congress ratified or approved the Treaty of Paris. It was almost 8 years till the day since the battles of Lexington and Concord. Okay, now from there, we're going to fast forward through the first 5 presidents, and as we're starting to expand a little bit more, and you've learned about some Indian removal, but now we're going to read about the Indian removal and the Trail of Tears. Native Americans and the frontier. Conflicts between people from different racial groups began in the early days of settlement in North America. Since the first European settlers arrived in North America and settled on lands that had belonged to Native American groups, repeated conflicts brought tension and mistrust. Often people used violence to attempt to settle these conflicts. Settlers, often greater in number and better armed, attacked Native Americans in efforts to force Native Americans to give up their land or in response to Native American raids. Likewise, Native American groups attacked settlers who had taken their land or threatened their way of life. A history of conflict and prejudice. On both sides, biases, stereotypes, and prejudices led to mistrust and hostility. White settlers saw Native Americans as dangerous and untrustworthy. Native Americans feared that settlers' hunger for land could never be satisfied and that settlers meant to kill them off. These fears fueled many bloody conflicts. Indian removal. In the eyes of government leaders, Native Americans east of the Mississippi River stood in the way of westward expansion in the United States. At first, they aimed to convince Native Americans to rely less on hunting. They wanted them to start farming cash crops such as tobacco and cotton, in addition to food crops. Government leaders thought that Native Americans would then sell any land that they weren't farming to white settlers. While many Native Americans in the South did adopt cash crop farming, they were not willing to sell their land. Meanwhile, prejudices on both sides stood in the way of white settlers and Native Americans living side by side. Pressure on Native Americans increases in 1825. President James Monroe had suggested a plan to move all Native Americans living east of the Mississippi to the land west of the river. At this time, nothing came of the plan. Yet, year by year, the pressure on the Native Americans living along the frontier grew. Those in the north occupied land good for growing corn and wheat and raising livestock. Native Americans in the south occupied land that was good for growing cotton. Around them, more and more white settlers arrived, many with enslaved African Americans. Seeking land to grow cotton, many white Southerners were demanding that Native Americans be removed by force. In 1825 and 1827, the state of Georgia passed laws forcing the Creeks to give up most of their land. Georgia then claimed the right to make the laws for the Cherokee Nation in 1828. Southern Native Americans on the Trail of Tears. Faced with threats of military action, most Native American leaders in the South saw no choice but to sign new treaties giving up their lands. They agreed to move to what was called the Indian Territory. Today, most of that area is in the state of Oklahoma. The Choctaw signed the first treaty in 1830. The Treaty of Dancing Rabbit Creek stated that the United States, under a grant, shall cause to be conveyed to the Choctaw Nation, a tract of country west of the Mississippi River. This was in Article 2, Treaty of Dancing Rabbit Creek, 1830. Now, in many of these treaties, you learned last year that a lot of the language, Native Americans didn't thoroughly understand what they were signing and agreeing to. The treaty allowed for Choctaw to remain in their homeland if they gave up their tribal organization and agreed to be governed as citizens of Mississippi. A few remained in Mississippi, but most agreed to leave to preserve their culture. Closely guarded by American soldiers, the Choctaw moved west between 1831 and 1833. The federal government, however, did not provide enough tents, food, blankets, shoes, winter clothes, or other supplies. Heavy rain and snow caused enormous suffering. An Army lieutenant wrote that one group walked for 24 hours barefoot through the snow and ice before reaching shelter. The Chickasaw people held out for payment for their lands east of the Mississippi before they would agree to move. Finally, in 1837, the United States government agreed to pay them $3 million for these lands. Expecting to receive this money, the Chickasaw spent $500,000 to purchase land from the Choctaw in what is now Oklahoma. In fact, the U.S. government failed to pay the Chickasaw the agreed amount for 30 years. The Chickasaw set out for their new land. Along the way, as a result of hardships, many became ill and died. The Cherokee also tried to hold out. They were still on their land in 1836 when President Jackson, left office. A small group of Cherokee agreed to become citizens of North Carolina. As a result, they were allowed to stay. Other Cherokee hid in remote mountain camps. Finally, in 1838, President Martin Van Buren forced the Cherokee, who had not made agreements with North Carolina, and those who were not in hiding to move. The United States Army forced more than 15,000 Cherokee to march westward in the winter of 1838 and 1839. They went to Indian Territory, patrolled by 7,000 soldiers. The Cherokee trekked hundreds of miles over a period of several months. Thousands perished during the march, mostly children and the elderly. This map here shows the Trail of Tears and its outcome, and you can see the territory where they ended up marching from. This land ends up eventually, in between the time period, the first reading that we did and the second one, this land belonged to the Spanish, but in 1819 was turned back or given to the United States from Spain, and then became Florida territory before it was a state. And so you can look at that. Almost done. The Cherokees' long, sorrowful journey west became known as the Trail of Tears. A soldier's description helps explain why. On the morning of November 17th, we encountered a terrific sleet and snowstorm with freezing temperatures, and from that day until we reached the end of the fateful journey, on March the 27th, 1839, the sufferings of the Cherokee were awful. The trail of the exiles was a trail of death. This is in the memoirs of Private John G. Burnett in December 1890. And then this painting shows the Cherokee people on the Trail of Tears being watched by U.S. troops. The Seminoles. The Seminoles resist in Florida. The Seminole Indians resisted the U.S. government. Led by Chief Osceola, they began fighting the United States Army in 1817. So this is earlier, it goes back in history. This is before Andrew Jackson became president. This is when he was a soldier. This conflict, known as the First Seminole War, ended in 1818. The Second Seminole War lasted from 1835 to 1842. It was the costliest war waged by the government to gain Indian lands. In the end, after a third war ending in 1858, the Seminoles were defeated. The government forced the Seminole leaders and most of their people to leave Florida. In their new homes in the Indian Territory, which is in present-day Oklahoma, Native Americans struggled to rebuild their lives under very difficult conditions. Meanwhile, white settlers moved quickly into lands given up by Native Americans. While Jackson's Indian removal cleared the land east of the Mississippi River for white settlement, settlers had already had their eyes on lands west of the Mississippi. And then here it says, stop reading here and answer questions 1 through 6 in your packet. You're going to use the readings we just did and the atlas pages to help you find the answers. Stop screaming.